A man died on a beach, and 70 years later, nobody could agree on who he was, or why someone would erase every trace of his identity before he took his last breath. December 1st, 1948. Somerton Beach, just outside Adelaide, Australia. The morning was cool, the tide low, the sand still damp from the night before. A man out for an early walk noticed someone sitting propped against the sea wall, legs stretched out, head slightly tilted, as if he'd simply drifted off watching the water. Fully dressed, a pressed suit, a neat tie, polished shoes, laced tight. Not the look of a man who'd been sleeping rough. He wasn't sleeping at all. When police arrived, they found a man in his 40s, well-built, no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle. But something about him was wrong in a way they couldn't immediately place. He had no wallet, no identification, and when they checked his clothing more closely, they found that every single label had been removed. Not torn away in a struggle, cut out, carefully, with scissors, stitch by stitch, as if someone had sat down and taken their time erasing him. An unlit cigarette rested on the collar of his coat, like it had simply rolled from his lips at the moment he stopped breathing. In his pockets, a comb, a used bus ticket, an unused second-class train ticket, a pack of chewing gum, a box of matches. Ordinary things, nothing that pointed to who he was. Doctors examined the body and found nothing that explained a cause of death. No poison detected in his stomach. No obvious trauma. And yet, 3 separate medical witnesses, testifying at the inquest that followed, agreed on one unsettling point. His death, in their words, was not natural. None of them could say what had actually killed him. For a country just stepping into the tension of the early Cold War, a dead man with no name, no wounds, and no explanation wasn't just sad. It was unsettling in a way that made people whisper. And the case had barely started. Weeks went by. Nobody reported him missing. Nobody claimed the body. Police, running out of options, made a plaster cast of his face and hands, hoping that somewhere, someone would recognize the shape of him, even without a name attached. Then, in January of 1949, more than a month after his death, someone finally checked a small pocket sewn inside the waistband of his trousers, a pocket so narrow, so easy to miss, that it had gone unnoticed until then. Inside was a tightly rolled scrap of paper. On it, 2 words, torn cleanly from the last page of a book, Tamam Shud, Persian, meaning it is finished. The closing line of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a centuries-old collection of poetry about fate, mortality, and the fleeting nature of a single human life. Police searched for the exact copy the page had been torn from. In July of 1949, a man came forward. Months earlier, around the time of the death, he'd found a copy of that very book tossed onto the back seat of his unlocked car, parked close to the beach where the body was found. He hadn't thought much of it, until the news coverage connected the phrase to his own glove box. Inside the back cover of that book, faint but legible, were 5 short lines of capital letters, arranged like a code. Investigators photographed it. Codebreakers studied it. Cryptographers still argue about it today. No one has ever definitively broken it. Some believe it isn't a cipher at all, just an initialism, a private shorthand, the kind of thing you'd scribble to remember an idea only you would understand. Others insist the structure is too deliberate, too patterned, to be random, that it's hiding something specific, something meant only for one reader. And in that same book, faintly pressed into the back page, was a phone number, unlisted, traced to a young nurse living less than a mile from where the body had washed up. When police showed her the plaster cast of the dead man's face, those in the room described her reaction as immediate. Something shifted in her expression, unmistakably, like recognition passing behind her eyes. But she told them she didn't know him. She never explained further. Not that day, not for the rest of her life. Over the decades, theories multiplied far beyond the spy angle alone. Some researchers floated the idea that he'd once been a professional ballet dancer, pointing to unusually developed calf muscles noted at autopsy. Others thought he might have been a merchant sailor or a smuggler passing through Adelaide on business he never lived to finish. None of these theories were ever confirmed. Each one simply filled a silence that facts refused to fill. This is where the case usually splits into rumor, because the facts simply stop and the guessing begins. Some believed she was protecting an affair. Some believed she knew exactly who he was and made a private decision that his name would die with him. Her own family, years later, in interviews given long after she had passed, suggested she may have had connections to intelligence work during the war. Nothing ever confirmed, only quietly implied. Was he a spy? The timing fits almost too neatly. Late 1948, Cold War paranoia rising by the month. An unidentifiable man with no labels, no records, no trail. A hidden code sitting in the back of a discarded book. And a woman with wartime connections who looked at his face and chose silence over an answer. Or was the truth smaller and somehow sadder? A man walking away from a life he no longer wanted any part of, quietly cutting his own name out of his clothes long before he ever laid down on that beach. Wanting, for reasons only he understood, to leave without being traced. For over 70 years, both versions stayed equally possible. And that's the part of this case that made it impossible to look away from. Not simply the mystery of who he was, but the mystery of how many completely different truths could fit inside the same small handful of facts. Now sit with that for a second. For decades, the only physical trace left of him was in a grave in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, marked simply, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." No name, no date of birth, just a stretch of ground that strangers visited for years, some leaving flowers for a man they'd never known, because the not knowing had somehow made him feel like everyone's. In 2021, more than 70 years after he was buried, authorities exhumed the body. The goal was simple on paper and enormous in practice. Extract enough DNA to finally answer the one question that had outlived every witness, every detective, every theory. It meant undoing 7 decades of certainty that this man would stay nameless forever. Because in 2022, something did change. Using DNA extracted from hair still embedded in that decades-old plaster cast, researchers applied genetic genealogy, the same method that has cracked some of the coldest, oldest unsolved cases in America. They built out a family tree, branch by branch, generation by generation, until it converged on a single name, Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne, born in 1905. According to the researchers, Webb had reportedly separated from his wife and effectively vanished from public records sometime in 1947. Old divorce papers, uncovered as part of the investigation, quoted his ex-wife describing him as a man with, in her words, no particular friends of his own, a man who wrote poems, most of them, she said, about death. If this identification holds, and as of now, it has not been formally confirmed by South Australian police, then the Somerton Man may not have been a spy, or a smuggler, or a soldier hiding from his past. He may simply have been a quiet, difficult man who slipped out of everyone's life quietly enough that no one thought to report him missing. But here's what still doesn't sit right. If he really was just Carl Webb, a private citizen with no secrets worth protecting, why remove every label from his own clothing? Why the code, sitting in the back of a book meant to be found? Why did a woman living less than a mile away, with her private phone number hidden in a stranger's belongings, look at his face and recognize something she would never say out loud? A name doesn't answer any of that. A name only tells you who died. It doesn't tell you why he arrived at that beach with his identity already stripped away, piece by piece. as though some part of him already knew he wasn't going home. Maybe he did know. We like to believe a name is where a mystery finally closes. But sometimes a name is just one more door, and behind it, there are more doors, still locked, still waiting. There's a version of this story where he's simply a lonely man who wanted to vanish, and disappearing meant more to him than ever being found again. And there's another version, quieter and colder, where somebody made certain he would never be found, and did it so well that, even now, with a name finally attached, we still aren't entirely sure. Both of those men are still lying on that same stretch of sand, somewhere in your mind, if you let them stay there. And maybe that's the real reason this case has outlived almost everyone who ever worked on it. Not the code, not the poem, not even the woman who said nothing. It's because somewhere, quietly, almost everyone understands what it might feel like to erase a little piece of yourself, to cut the tags out, to not want to be traced back to anyone, even for a moment. Most people never go as far as he did, but almost everyone, at some point in a life long enough to matter, has wanted to.